AJ, could you go back and compile like our best claps?
Yes. Can our 30th episode be the clapping episode?
I don't want to do that. I just don't think that's a good use of my time. I barely think editing the episode's a good use of my time.
That's where I disagree, AJ. I mean, I think editing this episode and this show and all the work you do for it, other than being a father to Jonah, is probably amongst the top 3 or 4 most important things you do.
I mean, it's very competitive with the father bit.
Guys, I just saw Sean Spicer has a new job.
What's he doing?
He's a paid speaker. He has his first paid speaking gig on September 11th. Man, he rallied so hard, dude.
You know, Corey Lewandowski is joining Harvard as a visiting fellow.
Are you serious?
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
okay. Do we want to do a little follow-up? Are we starting the show?
Should we start the show, AJ? What do you think? Have we blabbered enough? Or I think we should probably
we don't officially start the show until AJ says, "Are we starting the show? Is this the show?" AJ has to say those words.
AJ, does that ever appear on the actual podcast, or do you just say that and then edit that out?
I think we dropped AJ from the Skype call.
No, dude, he's still here.
Oh, AJ says his computer had a kernel panic and should be back up in 2 minutes.
That just seems crazy.
I don't know, but I'm out of beer.
At your house?
No, at my podcasting setup. Okay, so my first follow-up question for you, Ruch, is, remember how we were talking about left Twitter?
Oh, yeah, dude.
Do you think, is it possible, is your mind open to the idea that maybe your hate of left Twitter, more so than right Twitter,
hate. I don't know if hate's the right word.
Your vehement hate of left Twitter over right Twitter is a result of selection bias as opposed to anything else. What I mean by that is maybe you are exposed to more left Twitter than you are exposed to right Twitter.
Uh-huh.
And so you seem to think, oh, left Twitter is this evil place or this horrible place, and I hate all the people on left Twitter.
So hate's a strong word. I just think Twitter.
I'm not backing away from hate.
Yeah, dude.
Pure and
unadulterated. Hate. Satanic. Oh, okay. Satanic.
Yeah. Hold on. I got to add AJ.
Devil worshipping hate.
So do you think your criticism of left Twitter is a result of selection bias? That is, you're exposed more to left Twitter than you are to right Twitter or all the other horrible elements of Twitter than anything else? Because I think the prevailing theory, the last episode we talked about this by AJ, was that the left was being held to a higher standard than the right.
So I don't think it's the exposure issue. I don't think that's why. Admittedly, I do get much less right Twitter than left Twitter, because in the Slack, you guys are just constantly posting the shit that's on left Twitter. It's not as if you guys are constantly putting up stuff that's from right Twitter. You know what I mean? Because you guys, maybe ARPS is exploring right Twitter, but you and AJ really aren't.
No one knows who Arpin is, and now I have to cut this from the show.
So I do hold left Twitter to a higher standard. That is absolutely correct. And the reason that I hold them to a higher standard is because, we should ostensibly, if you've got oodles of education, you've been to Harvard a few times, maybe you even have a couple degrees from there. I hold you to a higher standard. You know what I mean?
But even Corey Lewandowski has been to Harvard.
Now I hold Corey to a higher standard, dude. Listen, Corey's going to violate whatever high or low standard that I hold. So, it's pretty easy for him to not meet standards. But yeah, I think that's the issue with left Twitter for me, is I do hold them to a higher standard, whether that's fair or not. But, honestly, they hold themselves to a higher standard, right? The left Twitter kind of has a sanctimoniousness that one can only have if one holds oneself to a higher standard.
I don't think that's true. I 100% disagree with that.
Yeah.
It seems to me that even if that is true as a normative judgment, even if you were to say that the left is more sanctimonious, which
No, just left Twitter.
But my point is that broadly, as a factual matter, the left Twitter, you couldn't possibly argue that left Twitter is more sanctimonious than other segments of society, right?
I don't know. I think I could.
No, but you would be wrong. I mean, I guess you could, but like anyone could do anything, right? Like you could jump off a bridge. I wouldn't stop you. But
that's very mean of you, AJ.
But further,
very mean. You would not stop.
Further, my point
Laissez-faire.
is that even if that were true, as a factual matter, that left Twitter is, say, more sanctimonious than other elements of public discourse, to say that journalists, like the kind of people who run the New York Times, even people who aren't journalists, so the people who run the editorial board of the New York Times, should take that into account in trying to present sort of a factual record of events, I think is crazy, right? Like, I don't think that left Twitter
Times. I'm talking about left Twitter. I'm talking about left Twitter. I'm not talking about the New York Times.
But my point last week, much more broadly, is that, in general, there's this whole segment of people who feel like the left should be held to a higher standard, and then those decisions translate into editorial decisions or journalistic decisions on the part of news organizations, or even even to the very limited extents we would consider Ruchit a pundit. I think that leads to skewed opinions on Ruchit's behalf, right? I mean, I think that even if you believe that the left is more sanctimonious, which I highly disagree with, and even if you believe that left Twitter is more sanctimonious, that still doesn't explain to me why, in offering, the sort of opinions we do on this show, that would influence the things that you say. Like, even if the left is more sanctimonious, that still doesn't give you any reason to hold them to a higher standard.
Well, I do hold them to a higher standard, and my reasoning is the left is typically more educated than the right. And so it's kind of like saying, why do I hold a 12-year-old to a higher standard than a 4-year-old? Well, it's because the 12-year-old should probably know better, right?
But
so
do you think that
like
repealing DACA is more forgivable because Trump has the impulse control of a 4-year-old? Is that basically your point?
No, that's not my point at all. My point is saying that, when all else is equal, so when you look at the behavior of a 4-year-old versus a 12-year-old, all else.
Do you really think
equal,
all else is equal?
No.
Do you really? No. But do you really think that the ideas of hashtag TCOT and the idea of
I don't even know who that is.
Are
equal? I don't even know who hashtag TCOT is, dude. I mean, I don't use
top
Twitter.
Conservatives on Twitter. It's basically the right wing analog of left Twitter.
Doesn't that feed my theory that Ruchit, your beliefs are based on selection bias?
No, my beliefs are based on the fact.
You don't know
I
who
admitted
TCOT is.
Whatever, dude. I'm saying that there's two things that my beliefs are based on. One,
you failed to convince me that it's belief that its selection bias is more entrenched now because you don't even know who TCOT is, right? Like,
dude,
TCOT is
nobody knows who TCOT is. You guys are still living in this fantasy world where a ton of people use Twitter.
Greg Abbott tweets with the hashtag TCOT.
Yeah, TCOT
everybody knows what TCOT is, but you worked at the Republican legislature and you don't know what TCOT is.
Yeah, TCOT is the biggest part of right Twitter.
Okay.
Trump tweets hashtag TCOT.
Yeah.
Okay.
So he did during the campaign. He doesn't anymore.
Well, hold on. See, here's the thing. Whether you like it or not, and you clearly don't, I do hold the left to a higher standard because I think they're more educated on balance than the right. I think they know better. And I think a lot of times they engage in sort of things that are not productive. And frankly,
Greg Abbott. Open carry is now law in Texas. Hashtag TCOT, hashtag Texas legislature, at NRA, hashtag TSRA, hashtag guns, at Texas GOP.
When was that?
2015. I mean, it was just the first result when I searched for Greg Abbott TCOT.
Well, listen, I'm not denying that TCOT is a thing. I guess what I'm trying to tell you...
You did. You said no one had ever heard of it, and then I showed you that Greg Abbott had heard of it.
I haven't heard of it, okay? So let's put it that way.
Well, you're everyone.
Yeah.
No.
But the bigger point, right, is that
No, I'm telling you that I hold the left to a higher standard. Why shouldn't the left want to be held to a higher standard? This is sort of shocking to me.
No,
right?
I think that the
Why wouldn't you
ideas
want
should
to
stand
be?
on their own, right? I think if one person is I think we should rescind DACA, and the other person is I think we should rescind DACA, and Trump is a shithead, and then you're oh no, one of these people used profanity, their ideas must be worse.
No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that like there's a better way for them to win the argument, which is just to make the argument.
I'm not putting this in the show. I'm 100% not putting this in the show. It's too embarrassing for you and me.
Okay. Here. So, do you guys want to? AJ, I think you put this in the show under follow up. New York Times is an establishment paper, more left than right. What the hell is that about?
Oh yeah, when I was editing the podcast, one of the things that it occurred to me that I should have said during the show is that Ruchit and I had a little bit of a back and forth about whether the New York Times is a liberal organization, and neither of us really thought that it was a liberal organization. But in talking about it, the thing that I should have said is that the best way to think about the New York Times is that it is an establishment organization. And so, sometimes the establishment view, or sort of the conventional wisdom on an issue, it can be left wing and sometimes it can be right wing. And I think more than anything else, the New York Times is pretty reliably sort of pro status quo or pro establishment, more than you would say that it is particularly left wing or right wing.
That reminds me of something one of my government professors, who was a Bush polling guy, used to say, that and this was before like Fox News, I guess, was really in its heyday. Is that the media, there is no liberal bias in the media. The bias is establishment bias, right? Like there's bias in favor of profits and establishment politics, and there's bias against non-establishment players.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah, I think that's right too.
But I mean, now in the day of like, or maybe even in the post Fox News world, I don't know if I don't know if he would revise his opinions or revisit those opinions. Do we want to talk about David Brooks anymore in the follow-up?
Yeah, I just thought there was an interesting piece that it'll be in the show notes that David Brooks wrote. David Brooks writes a lot
if it makes it past AJ's edits cuts, yeah.
Well, if it makes AJ's cut, true. Always a big if.
Yeah.
When Jonah listens to this podcast one day, he'll really understand that he who edits the podcast has power. Real power. Anyway, David Brooks wrote a good piece that, to me, brought up thoughts of identity and thoughts of sort of, what's the best way to sort of make friends and win over enemies in many ways in politics. And so anyway, I think people should read the piece. I think it has things that, are very easy to disagree with, and you're probably right to disagree with some of those things. But I think the broader points of it are good.
What's the difference between equipoise and equivocation?
So to me, equipoise is something that it's something that Barack Obama has, actually. And by that,
some might say that's equivocation too.
Sure, some might. And so this is what Brooks says, right? It's the ability to move gracefully through your identities, to have the passion's blessing and hurts of one balanced by the passion's blessing and hurts of several others.
I mean, the devil's advocate might say that that's just equivocation in fancier font.
Well, I guess what I would say is it's the equipoise, I keep pronouncing this word incorrectly, is that ability to on one sense see like multiple sides of an argument, but also to sort of really it's to understand where people are coming from. You know what I mean? To me, that's not equivocation, right? You can still have like firm beliefs.
I hate this David Brooks column. I'm tired of listening. Can I say what I hate about it?
This is very on brand for AJ to be extremely mad about a conservative writer. Continue, AJ.
Okay. So there are like 3 key passages of the column, and I think they're all terrible. So yeah. Okay. So first of all, he says, today the world feels hostile to, well, everyone. I had assumed that as a society got more equal, we would all share a measure of equal dignity. But it turns out that without an obvious social hierarchy, we all feel equally powerless. So, okay, basically, he has correctly identified that that today's strife is felt it is caused in part by a people's sense of powerlessness, right? There are people who are used to being sort of the dominant social group in society, particularly like white men, Christian white men. And a lot of those people are driving these sort of reactionary movements because of their perception of their lost of place in society. Okay, so David Brooks has like expressed it incredibly unartfully. The way I read what he wrote is that we all get to feel equally powerless without an obvious social hierarchy. And that's not true, right? Like, imagine all of the people who are empowered by our newly liberalized country, right? Like, imagine all of those people who already felt powerless and sort of denigrating their advancement in society by saying we all feel powerless, I think is an extremely white male New York Times columnist sort of reaction for David Brooks to have. Then he moves on. He says, it's human nature.
Can I respond to that?
No, you can't. It's human nature that we feel our slights more strongly than we feel our advantages.
Classic left
so we
Twitter.
all tend to feel downtrodden these days. White males and Zionists feel victimized on campus. Christians feel repressed by the courts. Women feel victimized in tech. So all of these groups are equal. Even Taylor Swift apparently feels victimized. So we've got women in tech, the working class, Taylor Swift, white males, Zionists, and Christians. All of these people are somehow
not what David Brooks said, but
no.
Go on.
This is what he says. He says group victimization has become the global religion, from Berkeley to the alt-right to Iran. Right? Like, I think he is drawing this sort of bizarre equivalence between women in tech and Christians.
I don't think he is.
Okay.
I don't think he is.
So then he says he gives three sort of prescriptions, and his third prescription is to practice equipoise, right? This is the trait we should be looking for in leaders. It's the ability to move gracefully through your identities. And the way I read this is, hey, F you Jews, if you're worried about Nazis, the most important step is to stop being so Jewish all the time. Right? That's basically what he says. The trait we should be looking for in leaders is the ability to move gracefully through your abilities, to have the passions, blessings, and the hurts of one balanced by the passions, blessing, and the hurts of several others. Right? So basically his point is like, oh, I'm sorry, Jews, you're worried about Nazis in society. You have to understand Christians and women in tech are both pretty hard off. We all feel equally powerless.
So I don't think that's what he's actually saying, but I can see how you read it that way. So Brooks is sort of talking about, and this is something he's talked about sort of over multiple columns over the last, I would say, 6 to 9 months, right? Is he's talked about this idea of identity. And so one of the things that what he says here is the people who exclude us try to reduce our myriad identities down to one simplistic one. You may be an athletic Baptist Democratic surgeon with 3 kids and a love for Ohio State, but to the bigot, you're just one thing. Your faith or skin color or whatever it is he doesn't like. And he says life is more straightforward when you're locked into one totalistic group, even if it's imposed upon you. When you're disrespected for being a Jew, a Christian, a liberal, or a conservative, the natural instinct is to double down on that identity. People in what feels like a hostile environment often reduce their many affiliations down to just one simple one, which they weaponize and defend to the hilt.
How do you read this? How do you read this in any way? But when Jews are persecuted, the solution is for them to stop being so Jewy about it. How do you have any other reading of this passage?
I think so. Here's something that I sort of mentioned earlier, right? And this was, when you neatly divide the world into sort of these single identities, I think what you do is you turn us into single identity politics, basically, and it makes enemies or sympathizers out of people that affiliate most closely with that identity, right? The neo-Nazi.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Like, does an individual have the right to be a single identity if they wanted?
Absolutely, they do. Absolutely. Absolutely.
So,
and I don't think anybody's taking you away from that.
How does that square with this piece then?
This piece doesn't say you can't have a single identity. I think what this piece says
it says you shouldn't, right?
It says that that's how people react to being persecuted, and that people who do that are not the people we want leading our society.
That's not actually what it says.
It literally says that.
No, it doesn't.
It says both of those things.
No,
it literally says that in
that's
the text.
That's why I have to read it, because you're interpreting the text in a way that I think is incorrect.
So what is the context that would explain this?
The neo-Nazi, or someone that's trying to criticize us, wants to reduce us to a single identity. Our response is often to latch onto that identity even tighter, which makes it a battle of identity politics and not of universal values. So I don't think neo-Nazis are going to stop being neo-Nazis. But what they are doing is they're trying to claim a single identity beyond what they narrowly are, which is a bunch of racist losers. Okay? If my response to their being racist losers is limited to, and I'm not saying you can't say this, if it's limited to I'm brown and I'm proud, that isn't a call for well-meaning non-brown people to join me. Especially when the neo-Nazi says, look, this isn't about me being a hater. It's about white people's broadly. It's about European heritage, history, blah, blah, blah. So my point, which is that neo-Nazi is trying to create this big-ass tent of hate. And he's trying to say, look, everyone like me, anything like me, in this broad identity of just being white, this single identity is being persecuted against. And here's what I'm trying to say. We're not going to stop the neo-Nazi from being a neo-Nazi. This isn't about sort of trying to convince a neo-Nazi, because we're never going to convince the neo-Nazi, not with like arguments anyway. So when I latch onto that single identity as opposed to sort of universal values, that doesn't create this big tent in response. Reduces me. Hold on, let me finish. Let me finish.
Okay,
Let me finish.
Finish.
It reduces me to this very simple object instead of being an individual. Now, if someone wants to do that, that's totally okay. I think what David Brooks is saying is, which I think I do agree with, is that you can't be, I think, an effective leader if you reduce yourself to a single identity, because then it does create sort of an identity politics. That doesn't mean you can't be proud of your identity. It doesn't mean that you can't, latch on to your, or it doesn't mean you can't be proud of your identity or you can't talk about your identity. And I think that's why when I read this, I was like, I actually thought of Barack Obama, because he's been somebody that's been able to move gracefully through his many identities. And he's a person that actually does have many identities, and that's what made him inclusive. And that's what got him elected.
I don't know. Tom, do you have like a takeaway, or is that like a dangerous question?
My thought is that I think if you read the piece the way that Ruchit is reading it, I don't think David Brooks is saying anything at all. Like I don't think he is saying much of anything meaningful, other than sort of like platitudes that everyone can agree upon. I think that if you read the implications that David Brooks, like of the statements that David Brooks has, then I can certainly see why AJ would react the way he is reacting, because that in essence that's what the implications sort of lead you to. You know what I mean? Like that the perfect line was that, let me just pull that very last line that we were talking about with the some people live this way, hanging around just one sort of person, loyal to one allegiance, leading insular, fearful lives, right? Like I think that's a microcosm of the entire piece. Ruchit, you read it as he's just saying, well, this is something that happens to some people, right? And
I think it can happen to people regardless of what identity is that they choose, right?
Yeah.
I think it could happen to it could happen to Indian people that are immigrants and that, don't find a way or a desire to sort of integrate.
Sure.
I think it could be evangelical Christians, right?
Sure. And that's what I mean is that if you read it that way, it's just a meaningless platitude, right? It doesn't really like help us resolve a conversation, or it doesn't really help us move forward, other than this like vague, like, like black box of a leader that is Barack Obama, right? If you make the implication that what he's saying is look, living this way, hanging around just one sort of person, is going to cause you, or will be a cause of insular, fearful lives, then it does, become a malicious sort of, or maybe not malicious is the wrong word, but it I can you know what I mean? Like, can you see how someone might take that implication as bad?
No, I think I can see that for sure. And I think maybe the other thing I was saying is this isn't, well, let me, I guess, at least say the way in which I think it's helpful, which is, I think if it's helpful to to acknowledge someone's pain, whether that pain is something they should be feeling or they shouldn't be. And so if there's a Christian out there that's sort of feeling oppressed by the courts, you know, whether that pain is legitimate or not, that's a real pain for that person. And it's legitimate to sort of address that. And it's helpful to address why that might be the case.
Sure. I mean, and I mean, this is coming. We're waving back and forth, right? Like in the wind, we're reading the wind, basically. Like at this point.
Okay,
let's talk about DACA.
DACA.
Let me ask you questions. Because when the political piece was released the other day, saying that Trump was planning on ending DACA with about a 6-month timeline, the first thing I thought of was, oh my God, they want to use DACA as a bargaining chip to get the wall, to get stricter immigration, blah, 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 right? My question is, like, what's the moral culpability there? Like, are they being reasonable or unreasonable using these 800,000, I guess, college students and, you know, various aged individuals as a bargaining chip to get something like the wall that would otherwise never in a million years pass? Like, funding would never be apportioned for something like the wall. I think that's something maybe we can talk about that is different than just saying, oh, DACA's good and Trump is bad for wanting to end DACA.
I mean, I think that's a fair point. Like, I don't know if Trump totally understands the enormity of ending DACA, right? Like, I don't think that there's any plan on behalf of the federal government to round up these 800,000 people. And I also don't think that, I think hardly anyone wants to live in a country with the kind of apparatus that could round up those 800,000 people on 6 months' notice. So what is the 6-month deadline that Trump has imposed on Congress? They're probably not going to rescind all of the work authorizations immediately. It sounds like they're going to let them expire as they expire. And, you know, I think that if you're going to do it in that sort of chicken chick kind of way, then I think you understand the enormous lack of force behind the bluff, right? Like, I just don't think this is an effective way to achieve any sort of change in policy. So
before we go too deep down, while we were recording the show, Trump tweeted out that if Congress doesn't do anything in the 6 months to figure out what's going on with DACA, then he will revisit the issue. So he tweeted that while we were recording, or shortly before we started recording. But you know, but at the end of the day, whether Trump creates an apparatus to round up 800 million people isn't. I don't think that's the issue, right? Like, even if he doesn't lift a single finger at the end of the 6 months, the fact that all of these individuals would be living in fear is pretty horrifying, because that would be their perpetual state of life, is always watching their back, always, you know, not knowing what their future will hold, not being able to plan for the future.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, right? I think it's pretty easy to understate the effect on individual lives that this would have. I don't know, Ruchit, what do you think?
It doesn't seem to me that it may be where Trump goes to use them as a bargaining chip, but I don't think he really, at least I don't think that's what he was thinking today. And it certainly doesn't make it when he says, if they can't legalize it, I will revisit this issue. It sounds like he just figured out what DACA is.
Yeah, the New York Times reported that aides were fearful that if Trump figured out what DACA was, then he wouldn't go through with the policy. I actually think that's true.
Yeah, and I think that's what he's saying when he says, I will revisit this issue. Because if you think about it, if he actually wanted Congress... So, I mean, let's just say, for example, that he wanted to use DACA to get the wall, right? As in do a trade of like, hey, I will legalize DACA, you know, if you give me the wall. he just sort of took that off the table by saying that if Congress doesn't do its job, he'll revisit the issue. So he just took away whatever leverage he has. I mean, he kind of showed his hand, right? I mean, so whatever that stratagem was lasted for about 3 hours, I guess, to get the wall funding. Honestly, I think it's good for Democrats that he has tweeted this, because I think that would have created a no-win proposition for Democrats, right? Is because they would have gotten a tremendous amount of pressure, rightly so, to sort of accept Trump's deal, you know, from folks that are impacted by DACA and who think the wall is stupid. And, you know, you might just say that, like, so, I mean, Congress could kid itself, right? I mean, not just kid itself, but Congress could say, listen, we'll put $500 million towards the $20 billion construction of your wall, right? That's a down payment. You know, it's 2%. You know, it's the American way, 2.5% down payment. You know, hell, maybe we'll even put 5% down. You know, we'll put $1 billion.
But let me ask you this: why would that be? Why would Democrats be in the bad position? Why would they not just simply say, "Well, Trump did this; he could undo it at any second"?
Well, I mean, they could say that, but I think this goes back maybe to the point that we started with at the beginning that AJ will no doubt be editing out, which is that maybe people have higher expectations for Democrats than they do for Republicans, you know, rightly or wrongly. And so maybe they would say, hey, you're dealing with someone that's completely irrational, but you have a chance to sort of do something right, even if it involves swallowing your pride. And so I could totally see, you know, interest groups going to the Democrats and saying, hey, just do the right thing, even if it means swallowing your pride and wasting, let's say, $1 billion of money. Because, I mean, and I'm sure, honestly, I'm sure that's what Trump would say too, right? I think Trump would go to if he was actually going to use that strategy, which it seems clear he's not going to, I think he would go to the Democrats and he would give them some version of what he told Enrique Peña Nieto. You know, do you guys remember those calls that were leaked, the transcripts of his call with the president of Mexico, where, you know, where the president of Mexico kept saying, we're not paying for the wall. And Trump was like, listen, I know you're not paying for the wall. This is just about politics. Like, you know, he was like, I need to be able to say you paid for the wall, is effectively what he said. Right. So it may be the same thing where Trump could go to Congress and he could say, listen, just give me a moral victory of saying you'll fund the wall by giving me like $500 million. Then for the next 4 years, I can crow about how I'm building the wall and you don't actually have to fund the wall and you'll get DACA. I mean, that would be a tough, I mean, don't you think that would be a tough thing to turn down? I mean, no? Okay. I think it would be.
I don't.
I don't judge anybody for taking the deal or not taking the deal, but
Hannah Arendt and George Orwell both make a really similar point to what Ruchit was saying, which is that to a large extent, you know, authoritarian forces, totalitarian forces depend on the decency of non-authoritarian elements. I think in this case, what we have is sort of this dispute between the left, or just even like members of the right who are not authoritarian, right? Like McMullen or whatever. And what Hannah Arendt says about it is that she was writing about anti-democratic totalitarianism in the early 20th century. What she said is that those forces depend on the decency of pro-democracy, pro-establishment left-wing forces, right? Like they in particular depend on the decency of people who believe in open discourse or believe in free speech or believe in governing the country. And they use this as an opportunity to take advantage of those people's impulses. So whereas on the one hand, the you know, totalitarians in 20th century Europe would have no qualms about imprisoning political enemies once they came to power, it was important to them on their rise to power to enjoy free speech and democratic protections. And so, you know, I think that exact dynamic is at play here, right? Where to a certain extent, I think Trump really does want Congress to do something, right? Trump doesn't want to be responsible for continuing the DACA program, but he also, I think, doesn't want to have to actually deport 800,000 people who, you know, are acculturated as Americans, who have grown up in America, who, for the most part, are educated and participate in our society, right?
And he could achieve that goal, right? He could basically just kind of let ICE deport who they're going to deport. I mean, it's kind of like what he's doing now, right? Is he's just kind of letting ICE do whatever the hell they want to do. And so, will they be able to deport 800,000 people, like, over a couple of years? No, probably not. But they'll be able to terrorize 800,000 people. And, Trump doesn't have a problem with them doing that.
I think that's right. I think that there is a whole wing of his administration who believes in this like low level bullying harassment of non-white people in America. In particular, like ICE has had a spate of detaining American citizens and trying to deport them. They've been much more adventurous in where they're willing to detain people. It used to be under Obama that ICE wasn't willing to detain people at schools or at the courthouse or things like that. And so I think that sort of like low level harassment is like precisely the sort of chicken thing that Jeff Sessions has stood for his entire career. But then when it comes to something like actually deporting 800,000 people who, for all intents and purposes, are culturally American, right? Like, I think that actually is the kind of thing that if you took Steve Bannon at his word, for example, that Bannon would not be in favor of. Right. If you took Steve Bannon's sort of American, like national populist politics, right? Like his point wasn't. Steve Bannon says that he's not a white nationalist, right? He says he's a nationalist. He says he's not a white nationalist. He doesn't need America to be specifically for white people, but he needs America to be for Americans. And I think that these DACA recipients are among the most quintessentially American people in our society, right? I think that Steve Bannon is against immigration and even skilled immigration, but I don't think that at the point where someone has lived in our country for 20 years and is going to college and has never meaningfully lived in any country but America for any part of their upbringing, like these are not the sort of people that you would expect if Bannonism to be against if you took Bannonism at its word, right? And that's why I really think that Ruchit is right on the core claim that Trump is depending on Congress to do the difficult thing that Trump doesn't want to have to do himself. Yeah, he's created a situation where Congress is spurred to act.
Yeah, until just now when he said, "If they don't do it, I will," or I'll take a look at it. I mean, it's just like it's sort of as if like there's a debt, the debt ceiling needs to be raised at the end of the month. And, this has been a problem that's been going on for years. But, the Treasury Secretary always says, listen, if the debt ceiling isn't raised, we're going to default on our debt, right? And that spurs Congress to act because we don't want to default on our debt. But if the Treasury Secretary said, if Congress doesn't act, I'll figure out a way to make sure that that we don't default on our debt. At that point, Congress isn't going to act, right? They don't.
Well, I think that's right.
I mean, and that's what Trump did, right? He says that if they don't act in 6 months, he'll figure it out. I don't know why he did this. The only explanation I can come up with is that he just figured out what DACA is. Like, that's the only explanation.
I think he has a terrible poker face. I think he has a lot of friends who are really upset about it, and he was getting a lot of pressure, and he tried to walk it back because he has a terrible poker face, and I don't know that he entirely understands his own administration's strategy. Like, I don't think that he understands.
Yeah.
Sort of the right. Like, I mean, but this goes back to my longstanding theory that you can't attribute any sort of artifice or strategy to Trump. You just have to assume the silliest possible explanation for whatever it is that he's doing. I mean, maybe you're right. Maybe the silliest possible explanation is that he just figured out what DACA was.
It might also be he listens to the last thing the last person told him.
Yeah, I think that's also true.
Yeah, I think that's right too. I think like Jared or Ivanka or somebody just got in there, just got back from vacation.
Come on, let's not give him that credit. Come on, man. Like, the New York Times tomorrow will publish an article saying sources close to Ivanka say that Ivanka pressured Trump into saying he'll revisit the issue. We know that's going to happen, so why do that work for them?
Well, in any event, someone, maybe it was Gary Cohn, who knows, came in and said, listen,
it was definitely not Mike Pence, that's for sure.
Yeah. Mike Pence is trying to stay as far away from these things as he can. Guys, I think we should call it a show, dude. It's like...
what about sidebars, dude?
Yeah, let's do sidebars. I'm down to do sidebars real quick and then call it a show.
Okay. You want to do your sidebar?
Yeah, dude. Mine is a link to an online class at Yale. Yale has a course on how to listen to music. And so I'm going to start this course. I'll report back every week on how it's doing and what I've learned. I will. Every week I will come in.
Okay, so can we make this an ongoing segment?
Absolutely, we can.
Wait, this is super interesting.
And no week you will have nothing to report.
Well, I mean, this is like 12 weeks worth. So or however many weeks.
This is a promise.
Hold on. How many?
This is a promise you're making to our listeners.
There's 23. Wow. That means I have to listen to a lecture a week for 23 weeks. Okay, cool. I'll do it. I'll do it. This will keep
Introduction to instruments and music genres.
Rhythm, jazz, pop, and classical. Gregorian chant and music in the Sistine Chapel. Anyway, this is supposed to be. I got this as a link from, I don't know, some newsletter. I don't even remember what it was, so I can't.
Professor Wright begins with a brief discussion of the distinctions between such broad terms as song and piece, symphony and opera, motive and theme.
Anyway, sounds awesome.
This is like good stuff.
Yeah, and there's reading assignments too. So I can't promise I'm going to do the reading assignments, to be perfectly honest.
Just like college. Just like college,
dude. At least I'm watching the lectures. You can't say just like college to that. Or virtually attending class, I guess you could say. Yeah. Anyway, so it should be pretty cool. I'll report back. I'm pretty excited about it because I actually know like almost nothing about music, certainly on like how one listens to it, and I don't listen to that much, and I feel culturally illiterate. I feel like I could have a musical identity as one of my 6 or 7 identities, and I've chosen not to thus far. So I'm learning.
Okay, my sidebar is on the same topic, and I'm sort of annoyed.
Sorry, AJ.
You stole my thing. Okay, so mine is a YouTube channel called 8-Bit Music Theory. And so unlike Ruchit's extremely highbrow thing, mine is totally opposite. So this is a YouTube channel where this person who has I think a fairly extensive background in music theory and analysis breaks down the music in video games. So they use like video games as examples as these like very complex concepts in music theory. So I don't know like how deep yours or Tom's background is in this kind of stuff. You may need a little bit of the Yale course. Oh, okay. I think you will definitely need a little bit of the Yale course before these videos make any sense to you. But so for example, the one I just linked to y'all is called How Pilot Wing 64 Brings the Funk. And so he uses the Pilot Wing 64 soundtrack as this example to talk about funk music. So like in particular, one of the like common techniques in funk is called a static dominant, which is when you basically just sit on the same chord for like a long time. Or there's something called like a secondary play goal or whatever. I mean, there's like actually like fairly difficult concepts of music theory, and he shows how video game music is actually well composed and is fit for whatever the purpose of the song is in the soundtrack. And he talks about popular funk music like Flying Family Stone or James Brown, and he shows how tropes that are common in that genre are used in these like video game music. So I think it's actually like for someone who has like a moderate background in music theory, I don't have like a particularly extensive one. I know like what roots and dominants are and fourths and fifths and like intervals, chords and stuff like that. You don't have to know a ton, but these videos are like really cool. These videos are a very interesting way to think about music.
Wow. So we have like given our listeners a real way to learn. I mean, we're giving them a link to the intro course, then we're giving them a link to these more advanced concepts. I mean, if that doesn't say American Heartland, what does? You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, this is the stuff that I think is makes it more enjoyable to listen to music. Right? Like I think I get a heightened enjoyment out of listening to music.
Yeah, that's what I want, right? Is I want a heightened enjoyment out of that stuff, right? It's kind of like when you go to a museum and you get the audio guide, it lets you have a heightened enjoyment of the pieces that you're looking at, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's totally right.
Yeah. My sidebar?
Yeah.
Has nothing to do with music. I'm
Why not?
sorry. But it has everything to do with the solar eclipse and some hardware gore. If you want to click this link, what you'll see is rental cameras that were destroyed by the solar eclipse of 2017. You can see some gnarly pictures of the sun damage on these like thousands and thousands of dollars worth of camera equipment. It's pretty awesome.
Dude, that is pretty nice.
Yeah.
These photos are gnarly.
Yeah, I know. It's like melted gear, like the internal components of these like highly intricate cameras, just thousands of dollars worth of lenses and cameras just completely ruined by someone looking at the sun too long.
Jeez. Can I tell you a secret?
What?
During the eclipse, I accidentally the sun reflected off of my like iPhone screen while my phone was off directly into my eyes, and I spent like a solid like 10 or 15 minutes worrying that I was blind.
Were you were you feeling it, dude?
I was like, I don't know. You know how you get like psychosomatic pain? Like if you're convinced that you like hurt your eyes, then suddenly your eyes hurt. And then I understood at like a very cerebral level that this was like totally psychosomatic and I couldn't possibly
Didn't make it less scary.
Reflection.
Didn't make it less scary.
But I was like, like until you like know, by the next day I was fine. But I seriously spent an entire day just like being totally neurotic about it.
You probably thought, oh my God, I'll never be able to read another David Brooks column.
Oh my God.
Maybe one day we'll have an episode where we talk about redistricting and term limits and non-compete clauses.
Oh yeah, we should signpost. Okay, I have a ton of notes about Posner's retirement, and I have a ton of posts about partisan symmetry in election law, and maybe we should talk about those in some episode. Term limits looks good for an episode.
I think we could do Posner, dude. I think we should. You know what would be awesome? This will take me like a few weeks to prepare, because it's almost like a gradual process. It would be great to just do an episode about Posner and like spend a few weeks like reading a bunch of shit Posner's written, reading about Posner, blah blah blah. Because I think Posner's awesome, and I was very disappointed with his decision to retire. I mean, how dare he?
Did you see his article where he came out as a Keynesian?
I did see that. And I liked the New Yorker article too. And he has all these books. Like, do you think like, I don't know, you know what would be awesome is if we could get someone that listens to our show. Well, no, I don't want anybody that listens to the show to be out this kind of money unless they're really rich. But to basically buy me a bunch of Posner books. So like just all of his awesome books.
Why don't you just check one out at the library, dude?
I mean, the idea of just having them all, not having to worry about what kind of late fees I'm incurring by not, you know what I mean? Like, it's just really
Actually, I'm like maybe. So we have a lead time because he hasn't actually retired yet. He's only announced it. So like now is the time when the iron's hot, but the iron will also be hot when he actually does retire. We should try to read one of his books by then and be able to review it for an episode. That's also a very bankable episode. I have a request. If we do like a whole show about one of the Posner books, can we do it? Can we do one of the books from after he became a liberal?
I don't think he ever became a liberal, did he?
He's a Keynesian who hates Scalia. He's like basically liberal enough for me to call him liberal.
I think he remains a libertarian.
I think he had deep. Yeah, I think he has deep misgivings about his conservative past. You know, on the topic of Posner, one of my conservative friends posted, and this probably, let's not put this in the show, but this is just after, just talking, preparing. One of my conservative friends posted this like quote from Posner as sort of like an indictment of Posner and the way he thinks about legal theory. But I actually thought it was very, a very good way to think about judging. Right? Which should say a lot, I guess. But here's what Posner said. I'll give you the gist of what Posner said. Posner said, when he has a legal problem, the first thing he does is think, okay, what is a sensible solution to this legal problem? What's a common sense, sensible solution that makes it easy on everyone, right? That's step one.
You know who doesn't think that? Gorsuch.
Yeah. Well, step two, he goes, okay, now that I have this common sense, sensible solution, are there any laws that prevent me from doing this thing that I want to do? Step three, if there are no laws, step three, is this consistent with the existing law, right? And I think that's a very good way of thinking about how to solve legal problems is start with the sensible solution and think, okay, how do you go, is it prohibited by law? Is it consistent with law?
I have two thoughts about that.
Yeah.
The first thought is that I think that is articulating that so explicitly, I think is fairly poignant, but I think that actual process is much, much, much more similar to how almost all judging happens, right? Like, I mean, if you don't think that
I don't think that's how appellate judging happens, actually.
I mean, don't you think that Scalia? I think that's totally how. Like, don't you think Scalia works backwards from the fact that he thinks it's okay to discriminate against gay people to get towards whatever it is he thinks the Constitution says?
Hold on. I think that's how a lot of judging happens, but I don't think that's how most judging happens. Like, I think there are some judges, and there are some good judges and bad judges who do this, right? I think Posner happens to be mostly a good judge who really thinks about this, right? And you can call it results oriented if you want to malign it, but I think a lot of good judges really do think, okay, like just forget about the law for a second. I have this problem between two parties. What's the best solution? What's the best common sense solution? Now that I have that in my mind, let's look at the law. Is it prohibited by law, and is it consistent with the law? Because those are the two that at the end of the day, that's what you're there to do, right? You're there to solve a problem between two parties that's in front of you, and you're doing it in accordance with the law.
I think that's right. I think the other point to make about that is that if you really believe that that's an appropriate way to go about judging, then you really need to believe in having wise Latinas on the court, right? Like you really need a diversity of perspectives, because if you are going to work backwards from whatever you think may be the most sensible result, then you actually need to have. Oh God, I'm going to sound like David Brooks for a second. You actually do need a bench that has a diverse background. And, part of one of the stories that always comes to my mind is that Potter Stewart said after the Bowers decision where the Supreme Court said that states could outlaw sodomy, Powell said that he didn't know that he had ever met a gay person. At the time, he had a closeted gay clerk. He actually had a gay clerk working for him that term.
Well, isn't that what changed his mind?
I think that is part of what changed his mind, right? Like that later he found out that he actually has almost no... He had a very cloistered sort of living experience. And I know that I'm 100% making Richard's point for the David Brooks article, and that's not my intention.
AJ, you told you so. I think Jonah would want you to spend more time editing this podcast.
One day, maybe Jonah can take over editing the podcast.
It'll just travel in the family for generations.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you'll still host.